Is there a greater weight than the past you never knew? I often wonder how many of us walk through life feeling the gentle tug of an absence of perfect, polished surface on the family history that, upon closer inspection, reveals a single, strangely smooth blank spot. For me, that spot was the 1970s. A clean, undeniable void stretching across 10 years of my parents' lives, a decade they simply bypassed whenever they recounted the epochs of our lineage. I was 86 years old when I finally understood that this silence was not accidental. It was deliberate, meticulously maintained, and rooted in something far more unsettling than mere forgetfulness or the casual omission of domestic strife. My parents, bless them, were meticulous chroniclers of their own lives. My mother, Evelyn, kept journals dating back to 1948, charting everything from the price of milk to the nuances of their first trip abroad. My father, George, maintained a comprehensive archive of photographs, labeled and dated with a precision that bordered on obsession. You could trace the evolution of their wardrobe, their anxieties during the Korean War, the joy of my birth in 1952, and the slow, dignified decline into retirement in the late 1980s. But between the late fall of 1969 and the early spring of 1980, the narrative collapsed entirely. The journals contained crisp, empty pages, bound shut like a tomb. The photo albums displayed a startling discontinuity. One page showed a vibrant, slightly bohemian couple celebrating Christmas in 1969. The next, they were dramatically altered, older, wearing the weary formality of 1980. The intervening years simply did not exist. For decades, I attributed this gap to the usual exhaustion of raising children, perhaps a move they hated, or a period of professional stagnation that they preferred to overlook. When asked about it casually, the reaction was always the same: a momentary flicker of intense, cold recognition in my mother's eyes, followed by a swift, practiced diversion. The 70s. Oh, those were busy years, dear. Nothing much happened worth remembering. Nothing much happened. A decade in a world of perpetual motion, this stillness was the first indicator that something profound, and perhaps dangerous, had been buried beneath the suburban tranquility they cultivated so fiercely. The change became noticeable to me only after my father passed away, leaving behind the immense, echoing library of his life. It was during the laborious task of organizing their estate that the pattern shifted from a minor family eccentricity to a palpable, breathing mystery. The 86th year of my life, a year usually marked by reflection and simplification, instead became a frantic investigation. I began to look beyond the surface of the albums and the journals, recognizing that the very effort required to create such a massive 11-year gap required conscious, coordinated action. This was not the silence of forgetting, it was the silence of protection. I started to compare their oral histories with the archived facts. My mother would often tell a story about a particular neighbor, a Mrs. Henderson, a woman who vanished from the neighborhood maps and memories around 1975. My mother's anecdotes about the Hendersons always ended abruptly in 1968, only to pick up again in 1981, mentioning neighbors who had clearly moved into the Henderson house years later. The emotional arc of these stories felt truncated, incomplete. It was as if a significant piece of foundational scaffolding had been silently removed, leaving the entire structure of their personal history slightly unstable. This feeling that something was profoundly outside of place is often the first true sign that we are standing on the precipice of a genuine discovery, a recognition that the established timeline is a carefully curated lie. If you find yourself nodding, if you have ever felt that same chill of historical discontinuity in your own life or the history books, I invite you to pause for a moment and consider that connection. That instinct, that slight internal tremor suggesting that the tapestry is frayed, is not merely curiosity. It is a vital human inheritance, a call to observe the forgotten threads. We are all, in a sense, detectives of the past, piecing together the true cycles of forgetting that define our existence. Allow that feeling to deepen as we explore the hidden corners of this decade. and perhaps share your own thoughts on what elements of history, family or otherwise, feel intentionally obscured. The catalyst, as it often is, was something small and seemingly insignificant, a plain, unmarked wooden crate discovered deep in the attic rafters, tucked beneath decades of holiday decorations. It was not listed in the inventory of my father's meticulous archiving system. It had no identifying marks, unlike every other storage container in the house. When I pried the lid open, the smell of aged paper and dry heat hit me immediately. Inside, there was no jewelry, no money, no simple cache of sentimental junk. Instead, there were files specifically. Files dedicated entirely to the 1970s. But these were not the beautiful, organized documents my parents were known for. These were scraps, fragmented newspaper clippings, heavily redacted letters, and, most chillingly, a series of typewritten notes meticulously logged in a hand I didn't recognize, categorized only by year and initials. The discovery immediately shattered the comforting myth of nothing much happened. In fact, everything about this box screamed that too much had happened, and that the suppression of this decade had been an immense, ongoing effort, possibly involving others. One particular file, marked simply 1973-74, the year of the shift, contained the most unsettling material. It wasn't about politics or culture, it was filled with detailed meteorological charts, celestial coordinates, and pages of dense, handwritten observations about local animal behavior. My father, an accountant by trade, had absolutely no background in astronomy or biology. Yet, here was evidence of intense, almost academic observation of the natural world. Alongside highly sensitive information about land usage and local infrastructure projects, things that had vanished without trace or public record. It was then I began to understand the nature of the silence. It wasn't about avoiding a personal scandal or financial ruin. It was about avoiding a recognition. My parents were observers, perhaps unwillingly, of something that demanded permanent, collective, societal amnesia. The pieces of the 1970s were not simply missing from their story. They had been surgically removed, archived in secret, and treated like highly sensitive intelligence. The strange formality of the files suggested a desperate attempt to quantify the unquantifiable, to make solid the terrifying recognition that had occurred during that period. When I cross-referenced the names mentioned in the redacted letters with old directories, I realized the full scope of the isolation. These people, the observers mentioned in the logs, were not just my parents' friends. They were neighbors, colleagues, and other seemingly ordinary people who had also abruptly severed ties with the world around 1980. The silence I had experienced in my own home was replicated across a small but definite community. They hadn't just moved away, they had effectively vanished from the public memory, leaving behind a common unspoken pact. The unsettling pattern began to emerge. The silence was a collective defense mechanism against an external stressor. What could possibly compel a group of stable, middle-class adults to systematically erase 10 years of their lives and coordinate a shared narrative of absence? The sheer volume of astronomical data in the 1973-74 file pointed away from human conspiracy and towards something cyclical, something larger. Perhaps tapping into the echoes of ancient warnings about cyclical returns and the necessity of forgetting. Had they witnessed a signal? Had they experienced something that fundamentally challenged the established reality, forcing them to become reluctant custodians of a truth too heavy for society to bear? I found myself holding a brittle, yellowed map of our local area, circled heavily around a now-demolished water tower and overlaid with geometric notations. This specific notation, cryptic and unsettling, bore the mark of ancient wisdom traditions, the kind of symbols sometimes associated with the Anunnaki concepts of inherited knowledge or the builders of lost civilizations. To think of my mild-mannered parents engaging with such esoteric, forbidden knowledge was jarring. Yet the meticulousness of their documentation suggested they were not merely dabbling, they were deeply involved in decoding an emergency. The gradual realization dawned. The 1970s were not a mistake they wished to forget, but a truth they were compelled to hide. The silence was the necessary barrier, the price they paid to ensure my safety and perhaps the safety of others. The psychological cost of maintaining such a secret, the agony of having to deny a full decade of one's own existence, must have been overwhelming. They lived their last years as caretakers of a void, knowing they possessed a secret that demanded both continuous vigilance and absolute non-disclosure. As I reached the bottom of the unmarked crate, I pulled out a single, sealed manila envelope. Unlike the frayed paper scraps, this envelope was thick, pristine, and specifically addressed to me, to Eleanor, upon reaching the age of 86. The handwriting, firm and deliberate, was my mother's. I had searched for the answer in dusty files, seeking historical proof, only to find the key delivered across time, awaiting the precise moment of my own readiness. This final, definitive item was the threshold. It meant that this entire excavation, this journey into the architecture of their silence, was not just sanctioned, but deliberately engineered by them. They knew I would search. They left the path. Now, I held the direct explanation, the final revelation that promised to decode the decade they erased entirely. We must open this together, but for that, we need to understand the true weight of what they tried to protect. The blank pages, I realized then, were not just missing data. They were the consequence of radical surgery performed on memory itself. They represented the years my parents spent carefully constructing an impenetrable shield against their own past. A historical residue so toxic they couldn't risk a single molecule touching the surface of our lives. The artifacts I had collected, the faded newspaper clipping, the cryptic bank ledger, the key without a home, were disparate pieces of this architectural denial. But the real key, the true cipher, lay not in what they left behind, but in a pattern of omissions, so consistent they bordered on the obsessive. It was the negative space that held the answer. I remember the precise moment the pieces began to lock together, not with a bang, but with the chilling click of a vault door closing 30 years ago. I was holding a small, leather-bound volume, disguised perhaps as a prayer book, tucked into the spine of an innocuous set of encyclopedias. It wasn't a diary, but a rudimentary accounting ledger detailing expenditures for a period of exactly 18 months. From late 1973 to early 1975, my father, a man notoriously precise with money, had scrawled entries that made no sense for a family of 3, struggling in a modest suburban home. Tithes $450, materials, the Great Hall, contribution to the architect. My parents were neither religious in the traditional sense, nor wealthy enough to fund large construction projects. Who were they tithing to? What Great Hall were they building? The numbers were far too large. Yet the addresses associated with the checks were frustratingly vague, often just post office boxes in upstate New York, far from where we supposedly lived. If you, like me, find yourself facing similar unexplained historical gaps, these small fiscal anomalies often contain the emotional and operational truth. The ledger tracks not just money, but allegiance. And it forces us to ask, what costly loyalties are hidden in the ledgers of your own family's past? I encourage you to pause, right here, and consider if there is a deliberate silence in your heritage, a gap in the timeline that begs investigation. Share a word in the comments, perhaps allegiance, if this notion resonates. And remember that delving into these stories requires careful attention to the details, the ones most easily dismissed. Subscribing to this channel allows us to continue these quiet expeditions into the inherited human condition, ensuring these difficult historical echoes are not lost to the superficial churn of modern life. The deeper I dove into the ledger, cross-referencing names that appeared, frequently names like Brother Elias and Sister Solstice, with the newspaper archives from the mid-70s, the clearer the picture became. The 1970s, that decade of yearning and cultural dissolution, was also a breeding ground for ideological experiments. My parents, then young and perhaps disillusioned by the post-Vietnam cynicism and the fracturing promises of the late 60s, hadn't merely moved houses, they had moved into a community, a closed utopian movement known ominously as the Arcadian Collective. It wasn't a dangerous cult in the conventional sense of extreme violence. But it was profoundly and aggressively manipulative, preying on financial desperation and promising spiritual and social rebirth, a typical response to the economic and psychological malaise of the era. The ledger wasn't a family expense report. It was my parents' record of their contributions, sacrifices, and eventually their desperate exit plan from this collective. It was the hidden cost of survival. They hadn't just joined the collective. They had heavily invested in it, sinking their entire savings. Everything they had inherited or earned into the Great Hall, a communal structure promised as the center of their new, perfect society. The newspaper clipping, once illegible due to acid decay, detailed the subsequent federal investigation into Arcadian leadership, focusing on massive fraud, tax evasion, and the illegal coercion of assets from its members. The collective hadn't dissolved peacefully. It had imploded spectacularly in a flurry of FBI raids and civil suits, leaving dozens of families financially ruined and psychologically shattered. My parents hadn't spoken of the 70s because the 70s were the period when they voluntarily surrendered their autonomy to a system that nearly destroyed them. The silence was protection. Not only from shame, but from potential legal inquiry and the lingering paranoia that the collective's leadership, still partly at large, might retaliate against those who left. This recognition brought a deep, unsettling unease. It reshaped the very architecture of my childhood. Every frugal habit, every instance of my father meticulously double-locking the door, every nervous glance my mother cast over her shoulder when discussing neighbors, it wasn't general anxiety. It was the shadow of association, the lingering fear that the collective's reach was long. It forced me to look at the historical parallel. How often do people seeking salvation in turbulent times end up sacrificing their stability, becoming observers rather than active participants in the grand narrative of history? The 70s were full of these moments of radical seeking, these attempts to restart civilization outside the established order. What did my parents have to do to ensure their escape? The final piece of the puzzle, the deepest and most painful revelation, was tied to the Keitha small, brass key found taped to the back of an old marriage certificate. It unlocked a safe deposit box my father had maintained, untouched, for decades. Inside, among official documents and notarized statements, was a handwritten, undated letter from my father, marked to be read only upon necessity. The letter was his quiet testament, his confession, to secure their exit and ensure their safety from the Arcadian leadership, who threatened anyone attempting to leave with ruin. My parents had provided critical, anonymous testimony to the federal investigators. This testimony, detailing the collective's financial manipulation and the specific locations of misappropriated funds, effectively destroyed the organization's remaining network. They hadn't just left. They had been instrumental in the quiet betrayal of the very people they had once considered their new family. "We bought your safety with our silence," the letter read, his shaky script revealing decades of suppressed fear. To speak of those years was to risk them knowing who turned the light on their darkness. "We became ghosts of that time so you could have a life in this one." My father confessed that the only way to bury the shame and the knowledge that they had compromised their ideals and, in a twisted way, betrayed desperate people, even if those people were wrong, was to erase the decade entirely. This was the inheritance of silence, a covenant of protective forgetting, enforced by the chilling reality of survival at any cost. It was a profound moment of quiet agony. Understanding at 86 the weight of a silence that had defined their lives and shaped mine. The 1970s in our house weren't just a time when nothing happened. They were the time when everything happened, forcing my parents into a terrible, definitive choice. They chose me, but in doing so, they sacrificed the possibility of ever speaking their whole truth. They lived out their days in a state of perpetual vigilance, trapped in the memory of the lie they told to save us. This pattern of cyclical forgetting, where a generation suppresses trauma only to pass on inherited anxiety to the next, is a powerful historical force. It reminds us that every civilization, every family has its lost decade, its hidden ledger. If you feel this history echoing in your own life, if you recognize the pattern of the quiet betrayal done for necessary survival, take a moment to reflect. Perhaps comment with the phrase, "the weight of 72, acknowledge the heavy nature of these discoveries. It signals that you have traveled this reflective path with us, recognizing the deep currents beneath the surface of everyday life. I finally understood the nervous economy of their lives, the aversion to large groups, the intense suspicion of charismatic authority, the quiet insistence on absolute financial independence. These weren't quirks, they were scar tissue from an ideological wound. The silence wasn't arbitrary. It was the mechanism by which they managed the profound moral compromise required to transition from committed utopian adherents to ordinary, functioning suburban Americans. They had to kill their former selves to save their child. And the 1970s became the tombstone for those discarded identities. What does it mean, at 86, to receive this kind of definitive conclusion? It's not simply history learned, it's history metabolized. It changes the tenor of every memory I have of them. The solemnity I mistook for general melancholia was the burden of their knowledge. The careful boundaries they drew were the perimeter of their fear. I look back now, not with pity, but with a profound, aching respect for the extraordinary lengths they went to keep the past buried. They were observers in their own lives for 20 years, constantly checking the horizon for the return of the shadow, and in the end, they succeeded. They protected me absolutely until the moment I was old enough, and they were gone, leaving me this devastating legacy in a locked box. The question that remains, the one that haunts the quiet hours, is whether knowledge of this deep trauma is ultimately a freedom or a new burden. The inherited anxiety is replaced by a conscious, specific weight. I am now the sole keeper of the full story. The last link in the chain that connects the bright promises of the Arcadian collective to the desperate betrayal required for its end. The truth of the 1970s is finally known, but the quiet work of processing it has just begun. The great silence is broken, but the emotional cost of that fracture is immense. If you have stayed with me through this entire difficult journey, if you recognize the gravity of inherited secrets and the extraordinary effort required to achieve survival in the face of profound systemic failures, then you are part of a community that values deep, truthful exploration. Your presence here, reaching the conclusion of this complex discovery, means you understand that the greatest stories are often the ones whispered, the ones that challenge our comfortable view of the past. Please consider subscribing to this channel now. Your subscription ensures that these deeper investigations into the hidden history of the human experience can continue. Give this video a like if this story of survival and silence resonated with the unspoken history in your own life. And, as we close this chapter, I ask you one final time to comment with that phrase, **, the weight of 70, **. By doing so, you acknowledge the complexity of my parents' choice and the enduring power of historical truth. The story of my parents' silent 1970s is concluded, but the larger investigation into the secrets we keep and the memories we inherit continues. There are other documents waiting to be read, other decades that refuse to speak. Join me in the next exploration, appearing on your screen now, as we seek to uncover the next layer of the hidden human truth.